great Greek fathers and the councils of the church held in the East are all a part of that marvelous catechism.
Let's take our next caller. This is Pat from Texas. Hello, Pat. What's your question?
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Likoudis. I have a question. How does the Orthodox Church function effectively vis-a-vis doctrine and dogma without recognizing the primacy of Peter?
Thank you, Pat.
Well, the point is they can't, and they haven't. A dogmatic development has stopped since the schism, since they have no authoritative voice that can teach the entire church. I mean, the function of the visible head of the church is to be able to give a definitive judgment on faith and morals. And among the separated patriarchs and bishops, there is no one who has that divine commission to teach the entire church and to settle doctrinal and dogmatic disputes. So they go on and on.
Now, there probably have certainly been a number of issues that have changed over the last 1,000 years in the churches, like maybe the involvement of women in their churches and maybe in liturgy, or were they decided democratically? Is that how the decisions are made as new changes are made, or do they just kind of evolve in the churches and they just accept their evolution?
You mean among the Orthodox?
That's what I meant, among the Orthodox, yeah.
Generally speaking, among the Eastern Orthodox, they like to work through synods.
Okay.
This conciliar principle, which is a very ancient principle. The problem is you can't have an effective functioning of what you might call conciliarity, or what we would call collegiality, among the bishops, unless they are with and under Peter. In other words, collegiality only works where you have a center of unity and a visible head of the church that can convoke councils, preside over councils, and confirm their decrees and declarations, which is what happened at Vatican II.
All right, let's take this next email. This comes from Marlene in Lakewood, Washington. Dear Marcus and James, thank you for the interesting program. Pope John Paul II has emphasized dialogue with the Orthodox throughout his pontificate. I must admit I don't know much about these issues. However, I did hear about a Balamande statement. Are you familiar with this, and could you briefly explain it? Thank you very much.
That was a statement that came out of the Middle East, in Lebanon, where a number of Eastern Orthodox bishops and Catholic bishops made a sort of a common statement, hopefully to advance the cause of unity. One of the things they pointed out is we have to do away with proselytism, namely any kind of unfair tactics, forcing people's consciences to become either Catholic or Orthodox. We can't have any kind of genuine ecumenism with that sort of tactic going on, which was one of the sad legacies of the past.
Yeah.
So the Ballerman statement has certain very positive aspects to it. There have been a number of, among the Melkites especially, unfortunately, a certain anti-Roman complex where they sort of want to get away from the doctrinal issues and just have discussions on charity and social working together, but not really coming to grips with the doctrinal issues involved. The big one, of course, being today the papacy. Yeah. In the Middle Ages, there were about 100 different issues that the Eastern Orthodox brought up on which to censure Catholics for heresy. But, of course, the best theologians today have gotten rid of all those medieval accretions and coming down to the real issues. That's one of the things that dialogue accomplishes. Where does the other fellow really stand? Forget the psychological, the sociological, the historical accretions. Let's get down to the real things that divide us so we can discuss them dispassionately and calmly and in accordance with the apostolic tradition.
Thank you, Jim. Let's take our next caller. This is Tom from New Jersey. Hello, Tom. What's your question for us tonight?
Hi, Mr. Brody. You do invaluable work for the church. Thank you. And Mr. Likoudis, you're a great witness to the faith as well. I hope no one's dissuaded by some of these issues that separate us from reading some of the great spiritual works of the Orthodox, from the Desert Fathers to Alexander Schmemann. I'm thinking of For the Life of the World. Their mystical component, especially with liturgy and the sacraments, tends to be something not often emphasized in the West. I have two questions. First, how much of the division between the churches do you think for lack of a better word, maybe attributed to snobbery by the Greek language against the Latin language. I know certain Greeks consider anyone who doesn't speak Greek to be almost a barbarian, and the Latin language in itself is much more legalistic and less rich than the Greek language.
That's fine. That's his first question. Yeah.
Well, I think there's something to that. It goes way back to the time of Aristotle and Plato, where if you were not a Greek, you were a barbarian. And there is this sense of intellectual pride and genuine pride in the achievements of the Eastern Fathers and Doctors of the Church. And but unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, it became a barrier to union. We can't have that kind of intellectual pride, which causes a sense of superiority, which can be very aggravating to the other side.
Well, you know, John Paul, as he's called us to prepare for the Jubilee in these 3 years, one of the things he's called us and the church to do is to look at ways in the past that we're to blame also, mea culpa. So we look back on the areas of division. Were there areas in which we look back and think, well, maybe some of those things were caused by maybe us?
We're all sinners, and that's a very strong trend in the writings of Pope John Paul II, calling for the conversion of Catholics, to be humble and not to have superiority complexes, and not to rail against our separated brethren, whether in the West or in the East. There must be love, but always in the context of truth.
Yes.
You don't sacrifice truth for the sake of going along to get along, or capitulating to the mores of secular society, which is a tremendous temptation for any kind of Christian living in American culture today. We're in a great cultural war, and we're not going to win that cultural war unless we restore unity among ourselves as believing Christians in the one visible church that Christ established on the Rock of Peter.
Well, we're running out of time quickly, but I want to get a bunch of more questions in. I know we have another phone call, another email, but we had one question I want to throw out real quickly, and that is, and this was a question that I saw on a monitor from one of our phone callers, and that is, why does it look like there are less problems, though, in the Eastern Orthodox, let's say, in terms of the liturgy, than we might encounter in the Latin rites?
Well, simply because they didn't go through what Catholics in the West have gone through in terms of the misinterpretations and distortions of the Second Vatican Council. What is happening in many of our parishes, and I can speak from first-hand experience here, what you see in terms of clown masses and polka masses and some of these other atrocities taking place has got nothing to do with the Second Vatican Council. But American Catholics especially have become victimized by the culture. It's a decadent culture, and it's won its way into the church. And that certainly is an impediment to union with some of our Eastern Orthodox friends who think that some Catholics have gone crazy.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take this next email. This comes from Claire Olson. It says, Dear Marcus and Mr. Likoudis, because the Last Supper was a commemoration of the Passover, obviously there was unleavened bread at the meal. Since Jesus used unleavened bread, why do the Orthodox churches use leavened bread, and when did they adopt that position?
That's a very ancient practice. Apparently in the early church, both kinds of bread were used, leavened bread or unleavened bread. In the East, except for the Armenians, as early as the 6th century, in the Armenian church, you're going to have unleavened bread. And certainly by the 7th or 8th century, common throughout the West, unleavened bread, the wafer, came into common use. There are some Orthodox who think that the use of unleavened bread is heretical, but that doesn't really represent an official position of the Eastern Orthodox churches. And that's one of the great problems in the discussions on ecumenism today. What are the official positions of the Eastern Orthodox Church on the doctrinal issues at stake with Catholics? Some Orthodox say the filioque is heretical, others say it is acceptable. Some say Catholics baptism, they have to be rebaptized, others say no. And you've got a whole host of these matters that the Eastern Orthodox have not been able to settle in any definitive way.
All right. I think we'll take our next caller, if we would. Hello, what's your name and where are you calling from?
This is Mark.
Yes, hello, Mark.
Hi, Marcus. I saw you speak at St. Barbara's earlier in the week.
Oh, great. Good to see you again, or at least talk to you again. What's your question?